The Alt-Right Playbook is a series created by a YouTube channel called Innuendo Studios several years ago as an attempt by the left to deal with ideas in argumentation that they simply have not been able to. Almost all of their videos in this series rely on a bunch of snide insinuations on how pretty much everyone on the right is more or less a bad person. And, of course, they don't have any particular useful definition of quote-unquote alt-right, and in this latest video you can see this very clearly, since basically the entire video is about normie conservatives, and not any sort of dissident faction. They do try to bring the far right in by the end of it, but it's very clearly an addendum that doesn't really have anything to do with the main argument of the video. With that said, I suppose we can just chalk the title up to that being the brand that they know people will click on, which you can see pretty clearly if you look at any of their other videos, since they have much fewer views. The video starts out with a story of a young new progressive guy at work. It's a Monday morning and he's in the break room, and he brings up politics while chatting with a few other people, and the old conservative guy from payroll butts in. Both sides go back and forth, exchanging some very basic talking points on healthcare, crime, and abortion. With the first two topics, the normie con from payroll uses some basic arguments like, hey, you can't fix the problem, you can't live forever, you can't get rid of crime.
Guy from Payroll takes issue with the new guy's comments about how patients in many other countries pay less for better outcomes. Guy from Payroll thinks overhauling the healthcare system would be a long and difficult process to create a system where he would pay higher taxes and have fewer options. And all for what? He doubts socialized medicine, if it even worked, would be worth the trade-offs, and even lets slip the phrase, "Do Democrats think they can live forever?" And he speaks passionately about how easily monsters can get their hands on assault rifles. But Payroll counters that even if you get rid of every gun in the country, criminals will just import them. A bad person can always find a way to do bad things, and why should he, as a responsible gun owner, be punished for the crimes of a monster? There is, again, an uncomfortable silence. Guy from Payroll fiddles with his tie. He doesn't like this any more than you, he just can't help himself.
Just from those two clips, the basic conditioning that the video's author does should be pretty obvious. He uses the light, happy voice to describe the young, intelligent progressive, and he uses the old, boring voice to describe the annoying conservative. The difference between the new guy speaking passionately and the old guy ranting is purely in how the video's author frames the discussions. But that's a surface-level issue, and that is how storytelling functions, even if it isn't the most honest form of argumentation. So that isn't the core issue. There is something more important that I want to get around to. The conversation moves on to abortion.
By now, new guy is looking to win an argument, so he steers you straight to Roe v. Wade. And Payroll is off and running, talking about how beautiful childhood is and how wonderful it is to be a parent, and how it's tragic for any life to be cut short before it begins, and how evil it is to have state-sanctioned, but new guy just can't keep his mouth shut. He says, if you wanted fewer abortions, you would promote comprehensive sex education and easy access to contraceptives, because that's all that has ever reliably lowered abortion rates in any country. All making it a crime does is determine whether the abortion happens in a doctor's office or a motel room. The guy from Payroll just says, ugh, I hate Mondays.
You may notice a really big problem here already, but I'll make it clear soon if you haven't picked up on it yet. After this, the narrator goes on to make clear what exactly the main argument of his in this video is.
Much as it pains me to admit, Guy from Payroll has made one genuinely good point this morning. Mondays suck. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the work week will end talking about how great Fridays are and begin 3 days later lamenting the scourge of Mondays. But what are you gonna do? We could start work on Tuesdays and end on Saturdays, but that's just kicking the can down the week. The cold reality is, week's gotta start somewhere, and even your most unlikable coworker has a right to complain about it and get sympathy. But why am I talking about it? I'm a YouTuber. Mondays only suck for people with real jobs. Well, because what I want you to understand today is that the conservative thinks about people dying of preventable illnesses, school shootings, and back alley abortions the way you think about Mondays.
As I said earlier, it's Innuendo Studios' classic tactic of implying that anyone on the right is just a bad person. Conservatives just think that bad things are a fact of life, and they don't have any desire to fix them. This is obviously a completely bad faith argument, and it's virtually impossible to have a productive discussion with a progressive that argues like this. But again, that's not my main point in this either, so let's move on.
The conservative mindset tends to sort things into binaries with no room for scale. Mass shootings either happen or they don't. You can talk about how much safer countries with robust gun control are, and they'll just say, here's a shooting that happened in England. Here's a shooting that happened in Australia. Gun control didn't stop them. You can't regulate evil. And this is the kind of sentence that can drive you up the wall, because it is, on its face, obviously true, but it's only applicable in this context thanks to the word that's implied but not stated. You can't regulate all evil. Yes, since they've had gun control, there have been shootings in England and Australia. Does it matter that these shootings are far less deadly and happen far less often? Does it matter that making guns harder to get has saved tens of thousands of lives? Like, do we really need to explain why stores put junk food you know you shouldn't buy right next to the checkout counter? Because the easier it is to do a thing, the more it happens.
Okay, so at this point, his main argument should be pretty clear. Conservatives just think that good thing good, bad thing bad. Bad thing ban, good thing don't ban. Full Grug mindset. Conservatives don't really care about reducing crime or other deviant behaviors. Again, this is an entirely bad faith argument, which is quite notable, because the entire point of this series is supposedly to help progressives navigate discussions with people on the right. But that isn't the case. The real goal of these videos is to ascribe bad intentions to anyone on the right, from normie-cons to image board posters. The point isn't to tell you how to interact with these people, isn't to tell you how to argue with BoomerCon from Payroll. It's to reassure you that he's a bad person and that you don't have to interact with him. But that's not what I was alluding to before when I said there was something to wait for. His argument is that banning something will make it harder to access, which will mean that less people will access it. This is, of course, 100% true. I've actually made this exact same argument in previous videos on this channel. That is just human nature. The more you have access to something, the more you will access it. That certainly isn't the only factor, but ease of access is a pretty big factor. He seriously does put it quite well when he said,
like, do we really need to explain why stores put junk food you know you shouldn't buy right next to the checkout counter? Because the easier it is to do a thing, the more it happens.
Seriously, that is actually quite well said. And I agree. If you ever say, it's just impossible to ban things, people will still do it anyways, and you leave your argument at that, you're just making a bad argument. But do you notice the problem yet? The three examples that he has used? Notice it yet? The three things that he was talking about was healthcare, gun control, and abortion.
Because the easier it is to do a thing, the more it happens. All making it a crime does is determine whether the abortion happens in a doctor's office or a motel room. Because the easier it is to do a thing, the more it happens.
So, when it comes to things that the narrator wants to ban, making things more difficult will make it happen less. But when it comes to things that he doesn't want to ban, like abortion, it's just impossible. There's just no way that banning it could possibly reduce it from occurring. All it will ever do is change how it happens. Which is, of course, the identical argument to what people make about the Second Amendment. The lack of self-awareness here is really astounding. I'm shocked that he could make this entire video, write out this entire script, draw all these pictures, and not realize that in the space of about 2 minutes, he completely contradicts himself, and doesn't even try to explain why these two cases are different. But I know the retort I'll get from any progressive here. The difference is science and studies. New Guy does, after all, say,
if you wanted fewer abortions, you would promote comprehensive sex education and easy access to contraceptives, because that's all that has ever reliably lowered abortion rates in any country.
Okay, yeah, so the difference is progressives have science and studies on their side, and conservatives don't. But, as anyone who has ventured outside of their echo chamber for more than 10 seconds will realize, on any hotly contested subject, both sides will have plenty of science and studies. This is something most of us nerds realize in high school debate club. You show up with your 5 studies, ready to destroy the opponent with facts and logic, only to be shocked to find out that they have twice as many studies to back themselves up with. With the Australia example that he cites, yes, it is true that after the gun ban there, crime dropped significantly. It's also true that prior to that, crime was dropping significantly. And it's also true that pretty much throughout the entire Western world during that period, crime was dropping significantly. Now, I'm not pretending to have the final say on that entire topic. It's very big, and the point of this video isn't to debate these 3 specific things that Innuendo Studios brought up. But my point is to point out clearly that science and studies is not all on one side. Both progressives and normicons can produce lots of science and studies to back up their claims. But for Innuendo Studios, he falls back on the human universal that
because the easier it is to do a thing, the more it happens.
when it's banning things he wants to ban, but when it's banning things that he doesn't want to ban, then suddenly it's just impossible. There's no way you could possibly reduce abortions through banning it. This, of course, comes back to what I've said before, and I'm sure I'll have to say many more times. No one, by and large, comes to their position by the result of reading some studies. Innuendo Studios isn't pro-choice because he read a few studies about it and came to the conclusion it was the best way to reduce abortion rates overall. And I'm not pro-life because I read some opposing studies. Our differences are the result of fundamental differences in morals, the value of human life, etc. But this is the classic leftist line. They just default and say, oh, it's science, this is what the studies say, don't you know? The video does actually continue to get worse. Remember when I said he didn't notice the contradiction on abortion? Well, he actually kind of does notice something. It's hard to explain, so it's easier to just show you.
And on its face, this seems completely contradictory to all the other things they claim to believe. Sometimes you want to scream at Payroll. How can you think regulating guns won't reduce shootings, but somehow regulating women will reduce abortions?
Yes, this is the contradiction that he notices. The hypocrisy of his hypothetical conservative that he constructed. But it's just as big of a contradiction for him. The only difference is that he's a real person who wrote out this entire script without realizing this. Really, it's even worse though, because he did realize there's a contradiction in these statements, but he didn't realize how it cut against himself. I can assume that this is only because he lacks an incredible amount of self-awareness, so much that it's almost hard to comprehend, or he's simply being dishonest. But don't worry, the video continues to get even worse after that, just a few seconds later.
But here's the real kicker. He doesn't. He doesn't think illegalizing abortions will make them happen less. What he wants is to throw people in jail for getting them. It's right there in how he talks about gun rights. Why should I be punished for the crimes of a monster? To him, the law isn't about shaping society. It's about who gets punished.
Now, this is yet again all the same things I've been saying all along. Just describing bad motives to conservatives, just saying they're all evil people. It is, of course, also mind reading the minds of millions of people based on a fictionalized character that he created. If you actually look at the world as it exists today, particularly in America, does it really look like one in which conservatives don't really care about whether or not abortion happens? Take, for example, those pro-life crisis pregnancy centers that the left loves to fearmonger about. Think about all those people spending all their time and money volunteering, trying to convince women not to get abortions. Does that really sound like the type of people who don't care about how many abortions happen? All they care about is that people get punished? I don't care if you think these centers are evil and dishonest. I think it's pretty clear they're motivated by a sincere conviction. As a different example, take all the states that have recently passed pro-life laws. To my knowledge, all of them only attach criminal penalties to the doctors who perform the abortions, not to the women who have them. Does that really sound like the sort of people who all they care about is punishment? Or is it more likely that these people are motivated by a sincere desire to save lives? But let's actually go over the data quickly too, because this is a constant leftist talking point. As New Guy says,
if you wanted fewer abortions, you would promote comprehensive sex education and easy access to contraceptives, because that's all that has ever reliably lowered abortion rates in any country.
So, a progressive would retort, yeah, maybe they have some sincere conviction about saving lives, but they don't really care about it, because if they really cared about it, then they would support our preferred policies. An in-depth breakdown of the studies on abortion is way beyond the scope of this video, but they are often based on things like comparing the US or Canada to Brazil, and find that Brazil has a higher rate of abortion despite it being illegal there, and conclude that bans must be ineffective. There is, however, many obvious differences between those types of countries. Most importantly, Brazil, or any part of Latin America, is much poorer than Western countries, and even more importantly, they lack effective law enforcement. Brazil, for example, has a massive crime rate, so it shouldn't be too surprising that they aren't able to protect people in the womb, just as they aren't able to protect people outside of the womb very well. But if we actually compare like data with like data, for example, American states, we can see pretty clearly that there's a pretty strong correlation with the more conservative states tending to have lower abortion rates. You can look at this map, and the data is linked in the description. But just look at, for example, Texas, which has almost half the abortions as California. Like I said, a full breakdown is beyond the scope of this video, but when the most progressive places, like New York, have the highest abortion rates by far, I don't think you can blame me for being a bit skeptical that just a bit more progressive indoctrination will reduce the abortion rate. Maybe, just maybe, social stigma and restrictive laws might be able to do something to reduce the abortion rate. And maybe the American state could more effectively enforce pro-life laws than the Brazilian state can. But responding to these arguments is really a bit beside the point, because it should be clear by this point that Innuendo Studios and this type of progressive have no desire whatsoever to have any sort of good faith dialogue. There are certainly many progressives you can have a productive conversation with, but this particular type is clearly only interested in demonizing anyone on the right and showing how much of a bad person they are. Thank you everyone very much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and most importantly, please do share this video with anyone who you think might find it interesting. Please do share these videos in whatever way you can. Growing on YouTube isn't easy, and every share that you do really does help me out a lot. Also, as I've said before in a few videos, I've launched a Discord server recently, so feel free to check it out if you're interested.